August 14th, 1944. Somewhere over French hedgerows. Captain Robin Olds spots two shapes cutting low across a road ahead of him, indistinct enough that he cannot yet tell whose aircraft he is looking at. He noses his P-38 Lightning down to treetop height, closing fast, until he is close enough to see the black cross painted on the nearest fuselage. Only then does he know for certain he is looking at German Focke-Wulf FW-190s. He shoots down both. Olds would later put the underlying tension in his own aircraft's reputation more bluntly than any historian has managed since. It is the beginning of a combat record that will eventually reach 13 aerial victories, and Olds himself will later say he got those kills in spite of his airplane, not because of it. Pause on that. The P-38's twin-boom, twin-engine silhouette was, by any measure, one of the most distinctive shapes in the sky over occupied Europe, recognizable at a distance in a way few other Allied fighters could match.
That distinctiveness cut in more than one direction. It is true that German pilots could identify a Lightning at a glance. It is also true that the aircraft most famous for that unmistakable shape spent much of its time over Northern Europe struggling badly against conditions that had almost nothing to do with how it looked and everything to do with how it flew at high altitude, in brutal cold, against opponents who, unlike the ones it had faced in the Pacific, were flying home turf in the worst possible weather for the specific engineering problems this aircraft happened to have. This is the story of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning's genuinely difficult tour over Germany, honestly told, alongside the airplane's real reputation among the enemies who actually flew against it. Part 1. Before it ever reached combat, the P-38 was already something close to a cultural phenomenon among young American men hoping to become fighter pilots. A 1941 survey of prospective aviation cadets found that 87% of them requested assignment to the Lightning specifically, drawn to its radical twin-boom design, its nose-mounted cluster of cannon and machine guns, and a silhouette unlike anything else flying at the time. Future aces described it as looking like a beautiful monster, and 8th Air Force Commander Jimmy Doolittle himself would later call it the sweetest flying plane in the sky. Two 1,600 horsepower Allison engines drove the aircraft to speeds and altitudes that made it, on paper, one of the most capable fighters in the American arsenal. Fully loaded at nearly 10 tons, almost twice the weight of the P-51 Mustang that would eventually take over its job in Europe. Despite that weight, pilots who mastered the aircraft found it surprisingly agile. A skilled Lightning pilot could throw the big fighter around the sky with a nimbleness that belied its size. And its lack of engine torque, since the two propellers rotated in opposite directions to cancel each other's rotational force, gave it handling qualities noticeably different from any single-engine fighter of the period. The trade-off, as it would turn out, was that flying a twin-engine aircraft well under combat stress required a fundamentally different skill set than flying a single-engine fighter, one the wartime training pipeline was not initially built to teach quickly enough. Part 2. The Lightning's combat debut over Germany began in earnest on October 15, 1943, when the 55th Fighter Group flew its first operational missions from England, engaging Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s directly for the first time on November 6th. One of the group's pilots later described the reality of those early engagements bluntly. Facing the Luftwaffe head-on over its own territory, we were not winning. The problems that emerged over the following months had far less to do with pilot courage than with a specific, compounding set of mechanical failures that appeared almost exclusively in the one operating environment the P-38 had not been thoroughly tested for. Sustained flight at high altitude, in extreme cold, escorting bombers deep into German airspace for hours at a time. Part 3. The Allison V1710 engines that powered the Lightning were prone, in the European cold, to throwing rods, swallowing valves, and fouling spark plugs, while their intercoolers frequently ruptured under the sustained high engine boost long escort missions demanded. The aircraft's turbo superchargers, meant to keep the engines performing at high altitude, would sometimes stick in an overboosted or underboosted state, specifically in the freezing temperatures common near 30,000 feet over Germany, occasionally causing catastrophic engine failure outright. An analysis of the type's early European operations found that a substantial share of aborted escort missions traced back to exactly this category of failure, engines coming apart in flight due to intercoolers over-chilling the fuel-air mixture, radiators dragging engine temperatures below safe operating minimums, and oil coolers thick enough with congealed, cold-thickened oil to starve bearings of lubrication. Problems that, according to at least one contemporary technical assessment, could plausibly have been addressed at the squadron maintenance level, but were not resolved quickly enough to prevent months of unnecessary losses.
British aviation fuel, chemically blended somewhat differently than its American equivalent, made matters worse. Anti-knock additives could separate out of the fuel-air mixture at the extreme low temperatures the aircraft operated in, triggering engine detonation at exactly the high-power settings combat demanded. Early Lightning variants carried only a single generator per engine, meaning the loss of one engine could also cost a pilot his electrical power at the worst possible moment. Part 4. The cost of these compounding problems came into sharp focus on November 13, 1943, during a mission escorting bombers to Bremen. 48 P-38s of the 55th Fighter Group set out that day. 3 aborted before even crossing into enemy territory. At 26,000 feet, in bitter cold that historians studying the mission have specifically linked to the aircraft's mechanical vulnerabilities, the group was heavily engaged by German fighters while trying to protect the bombers it was escorting. 7 Lightnings were shot down, 5 of them by enemy fighters, and the remainder to causes that were never fully determined, and 16 more limped home with battle damage. It was, in the words of 8th Air Force historian Roger Freeman, simply an unlucky day, though the underlying vulnerability that made it so costly was becoming a recognizable pattern rather than a one-time misfortune.
Missions like this one fed a growing, difficult perception within the 8th Air Force's own command structure that Lightning squadrons, however bravely flown, were suffering losses to mechanical failure and cold weather attrition at a rate other fighter types simply were not. A pattern serious enough that it eventually reached the desks of senior commanders looking for an explanation and, ideally, a fix. Part 5. Cockpit heating was its own quiet crisis. Unlike single-engine fighters, whose pilots sat directly behind a large radial or liquid-cooled engine that radiated some warmth forward into the cockpit, P-38 pilots sat in a central nacelle with an engine in each wing boom well out to either side, leaving them with only ducted engine air for warmth, a supply that proved wholly inadequate at altitude. Pilots flying escort missions at 25,000 feet over Germany routinely suffered frostbitten hands and feet, occasionally becoming so weakened by the cold that ground crews had to physically help them climb out of the cockpit after landing. Bomber crews, by contrast, had access to electrically heated flight suits that Lightning pilots tried and generally found unworkable in their aircraft's electrical setup, leaving fighter escorts colder than the very bombers they were protecting. One P-38 pilot, Second Lieutenant Jim Kunkel of the 371st Fighter Group, recalled the problem plainly decades later. On high-altitude missions, he said, the cold was severe enough that pilots simply had no good solution, since the engines sat too far away in their wing booms to radiate any useful heat forward into the cockpit the way a nose-mounted engine did in other fighters. Part 6. A separate, entirely different hazard had been known since before the aircraft ever reached combat, a phenomenon called compressibility, in which a P-38 diving at high speed and high altitude could lose elevator control entirely as airflow over the tail approached the speed of sound, the nose tucking further downward while the control column locked solid in the pilot's hands. It killed Lockheed's own test pilot, Ralph Verdon, during trials in November 1941, and it killed or nearly killed a number of combat pilots caught in high-speed dives before engineers fully understood the underlying aerodynamics. The eventual fix, a set of dive recovery flaps fitted beneath the wings to restore lift and let a pilot regain control, did not become standard equipment until late in the P-38J production run and the following L model, arriving well after the aircraft's roughest year over Europe had already passed. Until that fix arrived, the only reliable defense against compressibility was simply avoiding the high-speed dives that triggered it in the first place, a serious tactical limitation for a fighter whose pilots often needed exactly that kind of dive to disengage from combat or to intercept an enemy aircraft attempting to escape below them. And one more way in which the Lightning's genuine strengths, its size, its speed, its two engines, could become liabilities under the specific conditions European high-altitude combat demanded. Part 7. Perhaps the least appreciated problem was simply how demanding the aircraft was to fly correctly under pressure, a complaint documented directly by one of the Lightning's own group commanders. Colonel Harold Rao of the 20th Fighter Group, ordered to submit a formal report on the type's underperformance, wrote plainly that the P-38, as it then stood, was too complicated for the average pilot, describing in detail the sequence a young, freshly trained aviator had to execute correctly under combat stress. Switching fuel tanks using stiff, awkwardly placed valve handles, adjusting mixture and propeller RPM and manifold pressure in a specific order to avoid damaging the engine, managing a gun heater switch positioned where a pilot could feel but not see it, all while being attacked by more experienced German fighters. Get the sequence wrong, Rao noted, and a pilot risked destroying his own engine through detonation or overheating before ever firing a shot. Newly minted P-38 pilots frequently arrived in combat with only a handful of hours in a genuine dual-control twin-engine trainer, a training pipeline several veteran Lightning pilots later described as barely adequate for the complexity for the aircraft they were being sent to fly in combat. One former Lightning pilot, recalling his own path to the cockpit decades later, described training that included roughly 60 hours in a twin-engine trainer whose propellers could not even be feathered in flight, a fundamentally different and less demanding skill than managing a fully combat-loaded P-38 under fire, followed by only a handful of hours of live gunnery practice before being pronounced combat-ready. Frank Burchill, who flew combat missions in both the P-38 and later the P-51, recalled that near the end of his own twin-engine training, an instructor simply asked a group of student pilots whether anyone wanted to fly a Lightning that day. Burchill volunteered, expecting a supervised backseat ride, and instead found himself alone in a fully operational, single-seat P-38 on the flight line, talked through the startup procedure by a crew chief, and sent aloft with no further instruction at all. Another pilot recalled being handed a fully operational, single-seat Lightning on the flight line, with nothing more than a crew chief's brief verbal explanation of the startup procedure, expected to simply take off and learn the rest as he went. Part 8. All of this bears directly on the nickname this video's title is built around, and it is worth being honest about how solid the evidence for that nickname actually is. German troops and pilots are widely said to have called the P-38 Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, a phrase repeated constantly in post-war American books, documentaries, and museum placards about the aircraft. What is considerably harder to find is any primary German wartime source, a diary entry, an official report, a contemporary interview, actually using that exact phrase. Most serious aviation historians who have gone looking for the original German usage have come back empty-handed, noting only that the story is often said rather than solidly documented. That does not mean German pilots did not fear or respect the aircraft's silhouette, since its unusual shape genuinely was recognizable at a distance in a way few other Allied fighters were. It does mean the specific quotable nickname this video's title alludes to may be less a piece of verified wartime history and more a piece of post-war mythology that has simply been repeated often enough to feel established fact. This is not a small point for a channel built on getting details right. A story can be broadly true in spirit. German pilots really could pick a Lightning out of a formation instantly, while still being unverifiable in its most quotable specific form. And viewers deserve to know which parts of a famous story rest on solid documentation, and which parts have simply survived because they make for a good line in a book or a film. Part 9. Relief for American bomber crews, and for the Lightning pilots themselves, arrived in the form of the North American P-51 Mustang, which began reaching England in meaningful numbers at the end of 1943. The Mustang's Merlin engine and considerably lower fuel consumption gave it a combat radius exceeding 700 miles on internal and drop tank fuel alone, enough to escort bombers to virtually any target in Germany, while offering pilots a single, unified power lever controlling manifold pressure, propeller speed, and mixture together, a dramatic simplification compared to the P-38's separate, awkwardly sequenced controls. The 55th Fighter Group, the same unit that had opened the Lightning's difficult combat record over Europe, became the first group to trade its P-38s for Mustangs, and most of the 8th Air Force's remaining Lightning squadrons followed over the following months. Former Lightning pilots did note one genuine trade-off. The P-51's single liquid-cooled engine, unlike the Lightning's built-in redundancy of two, could be knocked out of action by a single, well-placed hit, leaving a Mustang pilot with no second engine to nurse him home. Some former Lightning pilots who transitioned to the Mustang later admitted a certain wistfulness on exactly this point, having grown used to the reassurance of a second engine on the long haul home over the North Sea or the English Channel, even as they acknowledged the Mustang's clear performance advantages once above 20,000 feet. P-38 advocate and historian Warren Bodie, who spent decades researching the aircraft, argued the type's real fix should have been a switch from its troublesome Allison engines to the same Rolls-Royce Merlin that powered the Mustang, a modification never carried out at scale, and even Bodie, staunchly loyal to the Lightning's reputation, conceded in a 1991 interview that its record against the Luftwaffe over Northern Europe amounted to no better than mixed results. None of this happened because the P-38 was a bad aircraft in any absolute sense. It would be a mistake to read this story as a simple verdict that the Lightning underperformed everywhere it fought. In the Pacific, flown largely by pilots who had accumulated more flight hours before reaching combat, operating at lower altitudes and in warmer air that never triggered the same engine and compressibility failures, against a Japanese fighter force that, however skilled individually, rarely matched the depth and experience of the Luftwaffe defending its own airspace in late 1943, the P-38 became one of the most successful fighters of the entire war, carrying Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire to America's two highest individual scores of the conflict, and flying the intercept that killed Admiral Yamamoto. The honest picture is not that the P-38 was secretly a weak airplane. It is that this particular aircraft's specific mechanical vulnerabilities lined up almost perfectly with the specific conditions of high-altitude combat over Northern Europe in the coldest stretch of the war, while those same vulnerabilities barely mattered at all in the different war being fought thousands of miles away in the Pacific. Pacific Theater P-38 pilots also benefited from a subtler advantage worth naming directly: greater fuel discipline, encouraged in part by aviator and consultant Charles Lindbergh, who toured Pacific fighter units, teaching pilots leaning and power management techniques that meaningfully extended the aircraft's practical combat radius beyond what European-based squadrons, flying in colder air and under far more time pressure, escorting bomber formations on fixed schedules, were generally able to replicate. The Lightning did not disappear from Europe entirely. The 474th Fighter Group flew P-38s in the ground attack role at low altitude throughout the war, largely avoiding the high-altitude cold that had crippled other units, and the aircraft's unarmed photo reconnaissance variant, the F-5, proved successful in every theater it flew in, valued for exactly the speed and range that had made the fighter version so promising on paper in the first place. Reconnaissance pilots flying the unarmed F-5 relied entirely on speed and altitude to avoid enemy fighters, rather than firepower to fight them off, a mission profile that sidestepped much of the sustained high-boost, high-altitude combat flying that had exposed the Lightning's engine problems most severely, and the type's photographic coverage of targets across occupied Europe fed directly into Allied bombing and invasion planning through the rest of the war. The Lightning story in Europe was not one of failure so much as mismatch. A genuinely excellent aircraft asked to do a job under conditions that exposed every weakness its design happened to have. Flown in its hardest year, largely by pilots who had not yet been given the training or experience the airplane actually demanded of them. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these. More aircraft whose reputation depended entirely on which sky, which weather, and which enemy they happened to be sent up against. And more honest looks at the nicknames, legends, and half-remembered quotes that have quietly outgrown the documented history behind them.
Robin Olds went on to fly 2 more wars in 2 more distinctive aircraft, but he never stopped calling the P-38 the most beautiful plane of his generation, even after everything it put him and his fellow pilots through over Germany in the winter of 1943 and 1944.